All right, good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you guys for coming. My name is Deanna Jones, and I am the Training and Education Committee co-chair. Mark, are you available to just let the folks hear your voice?
Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Bontatibus here, the other co-chair for Training and Education.
All right, we're glad that you guys are joining us for this Lunch and Learn session. And if you guys are ready, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. John Martz is a staff member at the American Association for State and Local History. For short, that is AASLH. It is the National Professional Association serving practitioners at history museums, historic sites, and related organizations. He serves as the director of AASLH's Public History Research Lab and as the senior manager of strategic initiatives. As director of the research lab, John leads AASLH's field-wide research initiatives about the public history community and the role of history in American life. He also manages several other partnerships, initiatives, and special events, including leading field-wide planning for the 250th anniversary of the United States. John is a historian of race and slavery in the United States and Atlantic world, and holds a PhD in history from Rice University and a BA from Lynchburg College. He is a native of New Jersey and will be a new Maryland resident beginning in December. Without further ado, Mr. John Martz.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me and letting me speak a little bit about the work that I do at AASLH and some of our research on how history work is carried out in public parks agencies. I will say I've been at AASLH 5 years, and after 5 years, AASLH starts to become a little bit more natural. So just a couple more times and then it'll roll off the tongue, I promise. But I'm looking forward to really speaking with all of you about this research and about the work that we're doing. And hopefully learning from you as an audience that I don't get to talk to very often in park practitioners, and learning more about your perspectives on history work and cultural resources management, and how you see that fitting in within your particular agencies. So without further ado, I have a couple of slides that I'd like to share. And so this presentation today is mostly focused on the results from a survey that we did over the last couple of years, published earlier in 2022, and I've gotten a chance to talk with some colleagues around the field about, and has really kind of directed us towards some new and interesting avenues of activity for AASLH. But to start, for those of you who aren't familiar with AASLH and the work that we do, as Deanna mentioned, we are a national professional association. We're a membership association serving both practitioners and institutions. We always are pretty intentional about using practitioners and not professionals, because so much of history work that's being carried out in various places around the country at museums, historical societies, historic sites is being carried out by volunteers, right? Being carried out by people who don't necessarily see themselves as history professionals, and that includes work at public parks agencies, right? People who have kind of been tasked with caring for cultural resources or interpreting history and interpreting the past, even if they don't necessarily see themselves as a history professional. And so we really serve history practitioners at institutions of all types and sizes, everywhere from the Smithsonian and major national museums, all the way down to the many thousands of local historical societies, local museums, places like that. We are, I think, very typical in many ways as an association. We provide training and professional development to our practitioners. So we do a kind of continuing ed professional development type work through webinars and workshops. We have a quarterly magazine and a blog, and so we have a book series, so through publications, and we host an annual conference each year in September that brings together these kinds of practitioners from all over the country. But another major part of the work that we do at AASLH, and I think where my my expertise and my role is mostly focused is on research and advocacy work. And this has been a growing part of what we do at AASLH, but really trying to understand the field that we're operating in, understand the challenges that our practitioners and our members are facing, and understand how we can use those insights to help people do their jobs better, help strengthen the field, help improve our own resources and professional development offerings, and really to help advocate on behalf of the field where necessary. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about the work we do at the research lab as a kind of foundation for this specific project on history work in public parks agencies. But the Public History Research Lab is something that we founded almost 2 years ago to be a kind of umbrella over all of our various research projects. So research has for a long time been part of what AASLH does, going back we've been around since 1940, and trying to track field-wide developments and questions has always been a part of what we do, but it's really kind of come back to the surface as a really important role for us as a national organization over the past several years. So I joined AASLH in 2017 and took on several new grant-funded projects, but they didn't really have kind of a home within the organization. And so in 2020, we established the public history, or 2021 established the Public History Research Lab to kind of serve as this central hub for AASLH's research projects on the role of history in American life, and how audiences are thinking about history and interacting with history and history institutions, and also the major challenges facing our field. And we really approach this work as kind of a research practice partnership. Right. I think we're in a unique position as a professional association in that we have this really close relationship with practitioners in a way that researchers don't often have. They're often approaching questions from what they think is interesting or what they might be seeing from the outside as some of the pertinent questions. But we really try to carry out research work at AASLH in a way that is directly informed by the experiences and perspectives of practitioners. And I think that allows us to really make some unique contributions to the field. And so we use our interaction with members through our committees, through our conference, through just feedback we're hearing kind of anecdotally from people to try to identify collaboratively with our members some big questions that are out there in the field that don't have answers, to try to work with researchers to find solutions to those questions, and really develop products, reports, and webinars and conference sessions in a way that can make that research applicable and really useful to our audience of practitioners. So some of the projects that we've done have over the past couple of years include a national visitation report. So something that we have done each year for the past 4 years of surveying organizations around the country to find out what is happening with visitation at their museums and sites. This emerged from a real need that we felt in the field from people coming to us and asking us, hey, this is what's happening at my site. Is that normal? Is that what's happening elsewhere? And we really wanted to have some empirical data to back that up in those kinds of conversations. So we published our most recent report back in October and found that the recovery from the kind of low visitation of the pandemic is ongoing. In February of 2022, we published a project called Reframing History, which kind of assessed how Americans understand what history is and why it's valuable, and used social science research to produce some new communications tools to articulate how we can best communicate what history is and why it matters. And then in June of this year, we published our first ever national census of history organizations, which was a really important project that tried to identify a very simple but very complicated question of how many history organizations are there in the country. And each of these projects kind of builds on one another and helps us provide kind of benchmarks for our members to assess what's happening at their institutions, and also helps us from an advocacy and national messaging perspective to really make sure that we're speaking to the whole field, that our members are representative of what's happening everywhere, and that we are being as useful as we can in providing tools for history practitioners around the country. So all of that is kind of foundation to the work that I want to talk about more specifically today, which is some research that has emerged from our History in Our Parks task force. So like a lot of our research projects, this kind of emerged really organically from our membership over the last couple of years. It's similar to what happened with our visitation research. We started hearing from practitioners and hearing from members that our resources weren't really identifying or speaking to the issues that they were having as professionals, right? We started hearing from a number of different people who were working in public parks agencies, but were managing a museum, were managing a historic site, had responsibility for cultural resources of some kind, and felt like that it wasn't that the resources we had for museums or for historic sites or historical societies generally didn't speak to the kind of unique challenges that they had in trying to carry out this work at public parks agencies. And so as we started hearing from more people, we eventually had someone who wanted to kind of lead this work within the organization, someone who was in Charleston County Parks in South Carolina, and helped put together a kind of task force of parks people who were responsible for cultural heritage and history work in parks agencies, who could help us think more clearly and better about this, about these kinds of questions. And so this group of parks practitioners helped us put together this task force, and was really trying to speak to and identify the unique challenges that history practitioners faced in these parks agencies. We wanted to, we had this kind of general sense that things were different in parks agencies, had this general sense anecdotally that there were some unique challenges there. And so the first task for this task force was really to try to put some data behind what this problem is. What is the scope of the problem? Where are these parks agencies? Where is this work happening? Who is doing this work within parks agencies? Who is responsible for carrying out the historical interpretation, the management of collections, the management of historic sites, and how is that work being done? Is it being done in teams? Is it being done by individuals? To really kind of have something more concrete that we could say about this issue in order to, be able to provide resources and provide support for these practitioners. And that's really the other kind of part of the work of this task force, and something we're continuing to explore, is how can AASLH best support these individuals? And these are people that aren't necessarily members of the association now, because they are operating within parks agencies and maybe don't see AASLH as kind of their associational home. So how do we reach these folks? How can we best support them? What kinds of things do they need from us? How can we partner with other organizations to best support high quality history work happening within parks? And so the first thing that we wanted to do was kind of a national survey to understand this landscape, to provide this sort of initial assessment of needs and challenges. Gathering, even though most of the agencies that these practitioners are working for are public agencies, which provides some level of data that we could gather independently. We really wanted to make sure that we were surveying practitioners directly so that we could hear from them how they thought history work was being carried out in their agencies, and really what their most urgent concerns were. How did they identify the challenges, and what could we do to sort of to support them? And so we gathered feedback from 265 practitioners in the winter of 2020, and then we published our report in the spring of 2022. And I'll just stop and say that I know 265 practitioners does not sound like very many, but I think this is sort of a kind of formative survey for us, right? That we were going from a place where there was no data specifically on this question, and that we thought that it was, rather than wait for grant funding or wait for the opportunity to do a really big nationally representative survey that would be much more complex and more time consuming and more expensive, that it was really useful to do a kind of simpler and quicker survey to kind of get a sense of the landscape that we were operating in, that can help us understand where future research was needed. So first, I'll start with just some kind of big picture findings. And I think this quote on the right-hand side from one of our respondents really paints the picture of the sentiment that we heard from a lot of different people responding to this survey, which is that doing history in a park district means I feel like a fish out of water, and sometimes the lowest priority when it comes to the budget and maintenance. My coworkers either don't understand my job or don't care because it isn't recreation or nature. And this was a sentiment we heard again and again from practitioners on our task force and people who responded to this survey, people who came to some of our conference sessions and luncheons and happy hours at our annual conference over the last couple of years. And so AASLH, we estimate based on some of our other survey work that there's somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 history organizations and many thousands of practitioners that around the country that are embedded within parks agencies. So historic sites managed by parks agencies, museums, historical societies, other types of entities that are managed, embedded within these kinds of public parks agencies, which is based on a kind of combination of other surveys we've done where we ask people if they are managed by a park agency, and our overall assessment from our national census of history organizations that identified more than 21,000 history organizations across the country. And really the kind of big picture sense that we were left with after we surveyed all of these practitioners about the challenges and needs that they have is that carrying out history work within public parks agencies really combines all of the challenges of doing history work at a small organization. Our census identified more than 80% of history nonprofits have annual revenues of less than $200,000. So there are a lot of small organizations, and AASLH has served them for a long time. But it combines all of those challenges with all the challenges of doing work at a public agency, especially around staff recruitment and retention, around budgeting priorities, around kind of communicating up the chain of command, rigidity of some of the bureaucracy that can make change within agencies really difficult. So it was really this kind of combination of challenges that make doing history work in public parks agencies uniquely difficult. And the big picture that we got from these practitioners was that they really felt like their work was underfunded, was understaffed, and that history work was underappreciated within their agencies. And I'm going to go into each of those in at least a little bit more detail. And then really I'm hoping to hear from all of you how you feel about this question and other insights that you can provide to maybe help put some more detail to some of these questions. So first, with regarding funding for history work, we asked all of the respondents to the survey how much their budget for history-related work was at their agency. And this was an interesting question because it's one that's become really standard on AASLH surveys, asking museums and historical societies what their budget is. And so you see we have about 15% of our respondents reported that that their organization, their museum or historic site within this agency has an annual budget of less than $50,000. About a quarter reported that they had an annual budget under $250,000, and another 11% had an annual budget of between $250,000 and $500,000. So about half of the respondents had an annual budget of under $500,000, which is pretty typical for history organizations. The vast majority of private nonprofit history organizations have annual budgets of under $250,000, and so most of them are really, really operating on a shoestring budget. But we were surprised, and it helped kind of clarify the unique difficulties of doing some of this work doing history work in parks, that almost a quarter of our respondents said that they weren't sure what their budget was. And I think that goes, again, kind of speaks to the difficulty of carrying out this work within public agencies. There isn't necessarily a dedicated line item of this is how much is going towards cultural resources management or cultural heritage or history work, or the museum. They might operate a museum or a historic site, but it doesn't necessarily have its own dedicated staff and its own dedicated budget. And so the fact that so many of our respondents had difficulty answering this question at all really helped clarify for us the kind of the ways that we needed to look in different ways and treat as unique practitioners who were doing history work for parks. More broadly, I think in our assessment of challenge, we asked practitioners and respondents to rank what their biggest challenges were in carrying out history work in parks, and fundraising, stewardship of collections and landscapes, and budgeting were all in the top 5 of their biggest challenges. So funding is really a huge part of how practitioners are seeing the barriers to carrying out high quality history work. I think they would have that in common with people more generally at history nonprofits and other institutions. But I think the questions about budget and the difficulty of identifying how much budget is allocated to history work within parks really puts a kind of unique spin on that. And then in our qualitative responses that we got from respondents, there was a more general sense that practitioners really felt like they didn't have the resources that they needed to carry out their responsibilities as history practitioners, as curators, as collections managers, or historic site managers. Another big takeaway from the survey is that people really felt like history work within parks agencies was very much understaffed. In our list of when we asked people to rank the different challenges that they face as practitioners, far and away the #1 challenge, or what was ranked as the biggest challenge, was staffing. We asked questions about how many people within their agency were dedicated entirely to history work. And most agencies have, or most of our respondents said that their agency has fewer than 5 people that were devoted to history work, either collections or site management or interpretation. And that was kind of irrespective of how much history work was being done within the site, how many historic sites they had, what the size of their collection were, things, how many museums they had, that these were very small staffs that were being asked to do an awful lot of work within these agencies. And in fact, we also asked how many of them had sites that were unstaffed entirely. And most agencies, most respondents, the agencies that worked for, had at least one historic site that was unstaffed completely, which I think speaks to the difficulties of carrying out this work when there are so few people that are asked to do so much. And so we asked respondents to kind of describe their jobs to us in a little bit more detail, to really understand the scope of what history practitioners in parks were being asked to do. And so drawing on some of our other surveys and our conversations with park practitioners, we came up with a list of different kinds of duties, of different categories of work that we asked people, are these part of your job as a history practitioner in a park, which includes management and administrative, education and interpretation, which we combined, cultural resources and preservation management, collections management, development and fundraising, maintenance, curatorial, and other. Obviously, the percentages here add up to much, much more than 100%, because so many people are asked to wear so many different hats in carrying out this work, which was really something that we knew anecdotally, but was really helpful to see in this kind of detail. So 80% of our respondents reported that they had more than one of these duties. Only 20% were responsible for only one of those lines. 20% of our respondents, fully 1/5, said that they were responsible for all 7 of these duty areas, right? That they were the administrator, the interpreter, doing the collections plan, doing fundraising, doing the maintenance, that they were responsible for carrying out every one of these duties at their sites. I know I worked closely several years ago with a colleague who worked for South Carolina State Parks, and she was responsible for a Revolutionary War site in South Carolina. And the stories that she would share with us were really kind of remarkable to me, and this survey helps put some data behind it. But she would talk about how she's putting together an interpretation plan to thoughtfully interpret a site where so many Americans died during the Revolutionary War in the morning, and then in the afternoon she was operating a road grader to pave the road that goes into her site, which always just seems to me kind of the typical and really illustrative example of what this work can be like at times, that you're responsible both for interpretive planning and for paving roads, or repairing water mains, or operating light construction equipment. And we saw that come through in the data with how many people said that they were responsible for all of these different kinds of duties. And so, in addition to the kind of quantitative responses, people's qualitative responses, their narrative responses to these questions really made clear that history staff are truly spread thin at parks, and they're responsible for a wide range of different types of responsibilities, and in a way that's not necessarily conducive to doing the highest quality interpretive work or following collections care best practices or interpretation best practices. And finally, this is something that came through more in the qualitative responses than in the actual data, or the responses to our more quantitative questions. But there was really just this overwhelming sense that history practitioners within parks felt like they were underappreciated. So this is a quote from one of our respondents that said, "One of our challenges is intra-agency cooperation, that is, helping our internal divisions all understand the significance of the historic sites and assets we manage." We just heard a lot of stories of people who are really dedicated to this work, really dedicated to doing thoughtful and thorough interpretation of historic resources, of collections, of their site, but they're trying to explain why they need to hire some new staff or need to explain why they need more money to a supervisor or a division director who's really concerned about recreation or really concerned more about watershed management or concerned about environment and in a different way, and concerned about and conceives of the role of the agency not as an interpreter of history, but as a provider of recreational opportunities. And so as a result, we had a lot of practitioners who really felt this sense of isolation within their agencies. They felt like they were the lone history practitioner. They were the only person who was really committed to this kind of work, and they didn't have the support that they felt like they needed from their colleagues and from leadership. They had a difficult time articulating why this work was important to leadership and to their wider agencies, because people, as I described, were unfamiliar with history work. And this particularly comes up when people are trying to make a case for budget or trying to make a case for hiring, that the job positions in the system don't align with what they need, or the salary requirements or education requirements don't align with what the person that they think they need to hire to do history work. But making that case to leadership can often be very difficult if they don't have the background in cultural resources and in cultural heritage and history. And just generally, there's a feeling of kind of a lack of support on the parts of these practitioners that were responsible for doing historic interpretation at these sites. So ultimately, our major takeaways from this report, and these are two quotes from the report, and I can drop the link in the chat once I stop sharing my screen. And to kind of put a narrative picture on this, is first, staff are expected to manage more historic sites than they have resources for, and each staff member is expected to wear multiple hats. Many of the internal challenges history practitioners face stem from the fact that they work for organizations unfamiliar with the preservation and interpretation of historic resources. Sometimes it feels as if leadership simply doesn't care about history at their park. And then the other major takeaway, and this was written by our task force of parks practitioners, right? Not by me. And that the other takeaway is that there's a need for a support community for history practitioners working for parks agencies. They frequently work in small teams to begin with, and the intra-agency challenges they face from their own management underscore their feelings of isolation. So we really just had this, these takeaways that people are spread thin, they're asked to do an awful lot with very little, and they don't feel like they have the support systems internally that they need, and they don't know how to be, and they're not necessarily in touch with history practitioners at other parks agencies who can help them identify how they've solved problems, how they've approached these different issues, which is one of the places that AASLH thinks that we can really be useful moving forward. So for us, some of the next steps that we've identified as part of this, or as a result of this research, one is really the need for just continuing communication and network building within this kind of niche within the history and parks community. So something that our task force is trying to do is to reach out to their colleagues to kind of spread the word within associations like MRPA, that history practitioners can find kind of a second home at AASLH, and trying to produce resources that can, through a listserv or a forum, that can really facilitate this kind of communication from people who maybe feel like they don't necessarily have, the people that they can talk to within their agencies, of helping connect them to people at other agencies to help them identify problems and solutions. It certainly helped us, put a finer point on the need for additional research. This was a relatively small and quick survey with, only 265 respondents. And so there's certainly a lot more that can be done here to understand the funding structures within history of, state and local parks agencies, the specific staffing numbers, the nature of leadership at these agencies and people's backgrounds and areas of expertise. There's a lot more that could be done, but certainly ASLH would want to carry that out, I think, in partnership with other parks organizations and other parks practitioners. And this is all helping us think about more about what kind of training and resources, professional development, continuing education that AASLH can provide to these practitioners, either in the form of webinars or publications, things at our annual conference. And those are all things that pieces that we're working with our task force on, and would love to hear from you all about how you sort of see this issue and what kinds of work you think history practitioners and parks agencies could really benefit from, what kinds of training or guides or publications. And we hope that this can be potentially the start of some future partnerships. And that's, partly why we made sure to share this report with parks agencies and parks and recreation associations, because there are a lot of people who are engaged in this work in various ways who likely are not connected to AASLH. I'd be surprised if most of you had heard of or interacted with AASLH prior to this. And so hopefully through some strategic partnerships with others who are active in this space, we can work to provide additional resources and understand the scope of the challenges and some potential solutions together. So I know that leaves us a good amount of time for conversation. So I hope there are more questions, but I do encourage all of you to kind of keep in touch with us if you're interested in learning more about our parks work or getting involved with our history in the parks work. Please, you can feel free to email me anytime, and I can help connect you to our task force chair, who is at Riverside County Parks out in Southern California. And you can read more about our research projects at aaslh.org/research. And I'd be happy to answer questions about anything related to our parks research or some of the other projects we're doing on visitation and history communication, or some of our work around the 250th anniversary, if you have questions. So I'd love to hear from you about what you think and what your responses are, and sort of how this all works for you. And I'll drop the link to the report in chat.
Thank you, John. Great presentation. Questions, guys? I was wondering how you got started in this field. What drew you to it?
Me personally, or as in, so I was a historian, expecting to go into academia, as getting my PhD in history, but I've always kind of had a better sense of pretty average historian, I think, but I've always had a good sense, at least compared to my academic colleagues, of being organized and thinking about big picture questions like this, and interested in kind of nonprofit work, and I've been fortunate. I've been able to do just about everything for AASLH in the 5 years that I've been there, working for a national association that is relatively small. We only have 10 staff members, has let me do an awful lot of stuff and kind of bank a lot of different experience in a short period of time. And I've just found that the research work is something that I really enjoy, and that I'm really, I think, able to add a lot of value in. And something about, I think I now speak the language of museums and public history work, and also speak the language of social science research. And so I really see my role at AASLH as being kind of a broker between those two worlds, of helping researchers understand the needs of practitioners and develop research that can be useful to practitioners, and helping practitioners understand how researchers think and operate. And so that's really, led me to this point, and hopefully going forward will help me be involved in more research projects.
Thank you.
And I just love questions that don't have good answers. Like, and this is such a good example of that, of, people asking us like, is this right? Is this what's happening elsewhere? Is this, it seems like a simple question and it's really, really complicated. And, those kinds of tangled knots are really fun to try to untie for me. Yeah, so a question in the chat, how did you select parks agencies to survey for this study? It's actually less scientific than that. So the way that we approached respondents for this survey was through AASLH. We emailed it out to all of our, our full email list, and we have, an email list we communicate with weekly of about 20 to 25,000 people. Many of our existing members are doing this work within public parks agencies, which is something we've gathered from prior surveys. And so it wasn't surveying the agencies in particular, it was surveying directly through the practitioners and asking them these questions. And so it was just a kind of an open link through SurveyMonkey that we used. And then we also did some work working with partners at state parks and recreation associations. I believe we tried to send it out through NRPA as well, to try to just ask as many people who self-identified as history professionals or history practitioners who were doing this work within parks to respond to the study. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this was, there's a more scientific way that we could go about this, but it would take longer and it would cost a lot more money. It's kind of beyond our internal technical expertise, and so we really wanted to use this opportunity to go from a space where we had only anecdotal information to where we had some kind of quantifiable data. And 265 isn't a ton, but it's something, and that's helped us kind of clarify what the issues are, clarify what the challenges are, and has pointed us to some additional research questions that we could pursue, are hoping to pursue going forward.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, so I see a second question in the chat on funding. Is funding distinctly different between federal parks versus state parks versus county parks? I suspect the answer is almost certainly yes, it is. But that's one of the questions that, I think we have realized that we need to have a better handle on. I don't think anything is quite like the funding structure and complexity of federal parks, and that there's probably a lot more commonality between how different state parks operate and different county parks operate. But I'm still kind of surprised and astounded at how different things are from state to state. So one example, when we were researching our National Census of History organizations, we reached out to, we wanted to answer the very simple, very complicated question of how many history organizations are there in the country: museums, historical societies, historic sites. And as part of that, we wanted to reach out to parks agencies to understand how many historic sites, like state parks agencies, to understand how many historic sites they had in their state. And so we would ask one state and say, hey, how many historic sites do you operate? And they would say 12. And then we would email the state that shares a border with that state, the state next door. Like Vermont would tell us, they have 10 historic sites. Massachusetts would email us back, incensed at the notion that a state parks agency would manage historic sites, and insisting that we were wrong and that we were emailing the wrong person, and that they couldn't possibly answer this question for us. And it was just such a good example to me of how different things are from state to state in terms of how the history ecosystem is managed at the state and at the county level, where you ask the person in effectively the same job in two neighboring states, and they give you two entirely different answers. One very straightforward, the other who can't even conceive that they would be the person to answer this question, even though their counterpart in the state next door had no problem with it. And so this is one of the areas where we would need to do a lot more research, I think, and doing research about public agency funding is kind of messy and difficult work. And so I'm not sure if and when we'll get to it, but it's certainly on our list of things that we're interested in. And let's see, Paul, to your question, do the budget funding amounts include capital investments or just the annual operating budgets? We asked about annual operating budgets. And so primarily that's, that is what respondents were giving us, but it's a little bit messy because people calculate those numbers in different ways, and people account for, big investments or grant funding or other kind of one-off categories within their budgets in different ways. And so we just sort of allowed for that allowed for those differences to coexist. And however people self-reported what their annual budget was is, kind of what we went with. But as I mentioned in the presentation, it really helped us make clear how many different ways there are to calculate budget for these organizations, and how difficult that is for public agencies where, potentially like they have a budget for interpretation and collections management, but their staffing is accounted for outside of that budget, or HR and technology and facilities are accounted for outside of that budget. And so they didn't really know how to respond. So answering that and working with these organizations requires kind of a different tack at times. And I guess I'm just curious to hear from all of you a little bit, like, do the things that we found through this survey sort of align with your experiences, or was this mostly new to you or eye-opening to you? How does this land with all of you, since I don't get a chance to talk to parks professionals all that often?
So I'm with Kent County, Maryland, and we do not actually receive any funding for our historic sites. And it was something that a few years ago I had submitted a proposal to put in that into our department so that we have quite a few historic sites that are starting to get really run down, but that have a pretty nice rich history that could attract tourism. And we just didn't have the interest. We couldn't get it passed through our commissioners. And I've also worked in parks and historic sites up in Pennsylvania, where the parks department, as far as the outdoor environmental parks department, didn't want a crossover into the historic sites. So we did have historic sites and we did have parks with very interesting historic pasts, but they did not want the park rangers to focus in on that history. They just wanted them to focus. They wanted to keep that all very separate. So I would say it's pretty dead on to what I've been experiencing.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I have some thoughts about that, but I'll allow others to say if it, first, if it aligns with sort of what they're thinking and feeling, or sounds familiar, unfamiliar. Okay, so I will say then two things, Jessica. One, the research project we published back in February called Reframing History we did this 2-year kind of deep dive research project working with the Frameworks Institute. And Frameworks is a kind of communications advocacy think tank and research organization that helps to understand kind of public discourse around major social issues, and then test different communication strategies for most effectively conveying the message you want to convey. And so we worked with them to help understand how we could best communicate about the value of history and the value of history institutions. And I think, and we came up with 4, really rigorously tested communication strategies of how to convey why history matters, of its importance for helping people learn critical thinking skills, the value of learning history for helping society make progress towards justice, for communicating what exactly history and historic interpretation is. And all of this is, and so you can find that at the same aslh.org/research called Reframing History. But all of those communication strategies are really built for communicating to non-history audiences the value of history work. And so we mainly think about them in terms of a kind of public communications campaigns, membership appeals, advocacy, fundraising, things like that. But I think they can also be really powerful tools for internal work for agencies like parks agencies, where there are people who are doing history work within the agency, and they're trying to explain to leadership or to colleagues why this work matters and why the public might care about it, and to give them tools for best articulating that message. And I think it can be a powerful piece kind of for those kind of internal communications. And then I also think you mentioned, kind of cultural heritage tourism. This is one of the places where I think the upcoming 250th anniversary really offers a kind of important tool for this sort of internal advocacy of, I think big anniversaries and big events are things that, people who aren't engaged in history work can really wrap their heads around in a different way. And, saying that, articulating how that anniversary is coming and the potential investments there are from corporate funders and from foundation funders, and the potential interest from members of the public in heritage tourism around history, not just connected to the revolution, but all of American history in 2026 is potentially a way to, I think, to generate some greater support internally for dedicating resources now to historic sites and collections and updating interpretation and things like that. Any other
questions?
Can we
Alright.
get a copy of the report if we email you?
Here, I can put the link again back in the chat. You can find it right here, the full report.
And I can send it out, John, to everybody.
Great,
And I
thank
will
you.
also, since I recorded this, it will be posted on our YouTube page, which I will post in the chat as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. By all means, if you're interested in learning more about the work or getting involved in it in some way, or have ideas about things AASLH can do to better support history practitioners within parks, please reach out and let me know.
Thank you, John. On behalf of the
Thank
Maryland
you.
Recreation and Parks Association, we greatly appreciate the presentation. We've been working on this one for some months, so finally got here. Very good job.
Yeah, thank you all very much, and I'll
Thank
be
you.
joining you in Maryland soon.
Thank
See ya.
you.
Yeah, thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.